Me llamo Daniel y trabajo como consultor y me han contratado Open Trade Gate Sweden para hablar a ustedes del mercado sueco y la parte comercial. Hablo español y empecé a estudiar y aprender español aquí en Guatemala hace 3 años y me encanta estar de vuelta. Pero igual, mi inglés es mejor, entonces esta presentación va a ser en inglés. So in this first part, there will be a short introduction of Sweden, its people, culture, and then we move over to the trends, looking at CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, which is on everybody's lips at the moment in Northwest Europe. All companies are discussing these questions. And finally, we look at certificates, the voluntary certificates that are requested by the supermarkets and the retailers. And as Sonja said earlier, sometimes there's a confusion between Suecia and Suiza. Entonces, highlighted in blue is Sweden, up in the north. And it's a big country in terms of size, almost the same size as France or Spain. In terms of population, it's a small country. Only 9.5 million people, which stands for approximately 0.1% of the world's total population. And in the late 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe. Actually so poor, so up to 1.5 million people emigrated to mainly North America. This changed during the industrialization, and between 1900 and 1950, Sweden went through a rapid economic development. The main reason was investments made in railroads and railroad systems, gaining access to natural resources up in the north. They went for export and domestic production. During these 50 years, society also went through dramatic changes, and the government had an active aim to create security for the individual. Everybody should have basic security in all phases of life, from schools to healthcare to elderly care, and this was financed and is financed by high taxes. Here we have some numbers, Sweden in numbers. The first one is quite remarkable. We're on top of single households in the world. Almost half the population is living on their own, so 1 people per house. And in the bigger cities in Sweden, it's even more. It's up to 55%, 60 maybe in Stockholm. Another trend is urbanization. More people are moving to the cities and leaving the countryside. Before I started to work as a consultant, I worked as a buyer in a group of supermarket chains in Europe. And in the beginning of my career, while doing business with companies outside Sweden and outside Europe, I've sometimes been considered to be a bit unpolite or rude even. And that has never been my intention, but it's more about the Swedish way of communicating. We're quite direct. We don't spend that much time on small talks, and we try to get directly to the point, which sometimes can be considered to be unpolite. Furthermore, we don't use titles. That's something in the past in Sweden, so senior, doctor, we don't use. And that could also be considered to be a bit unpolite. And this is also affected in the organizations of the companies. Most companies have a so-called flat organization, so there are not many steps between the regular workers and the big boss of the company. Everybody is on you terms, and you can have a coffee with your boss the same way as you have coffee with your work colleague. One weak point, as I see it, of Swedish corporate culture is the strong belief in consensus. Everybody should have the say in the decision making. So this sometimes could lead to decision taking a very long time. So here basically is a summary what I already talked about. What's interesting is that the bigger corporations in Sweden, like Volvo, Ericsson, ABB, they were more or less forced to start export early because the domestic market in Sweden is insufficient with only 9 million people. And here's a simplified timeline of Swedish exports. We started out with natural resources like iron ore and forest. Nowadays we export a lot of cars, telecom equipments. And for the future, well, it's difficult for us to compete as a production country. Most countries around the world can do it cheaper than us. So focus nowadays is on technology and IT. And also Swedish design and cuisine is growing. Here we have Sweden's trading partner, both import and export by continent. And as you can see, Europe is extremely important for us. Everything that happens in Europe is affecting us as a country. And Latin America and Africa is more or less on the same level, both concerning export and import. Here we have Swedish export by category. Machinery stands for almost half, and that includes cars and telecom products. And also the pillar stones, the first natural resources that we're going to export, is still important for us. On import is basically the same category that's imported. We import cars, we import technical equipment and oil. If we look at foodstuff, practically the only category where we produce more than we consume is grain and products of grain. There we are self-sufficient. Also on butter and egg and milk, we are basically self-sufficient. We import a lot of fruit and vegetables, and that's mainly have to do with the climate. It's difficult to grow anything when there's snow and minus degrees. During warmer parts of the year, we do have quite a lot of domestic production, but mainly on vegetables. Most fruits are imported. We have some apples and pears, strawberries, but most fruit is imported from Europe and outside Europe. Coffee. Coffee we import. We don't grow coffee, no. Here's a chart showing what Swedish households are spending the money on. Healthcare is at 3% and education only 1%, and that relates to the welfare system we have with high taxes. You don't spend money privately on education and healthcare. Foodstuff stands for 12%, and that is foodstuff bought from supermarkets. That number is actually on the decrease, while restaurants and hotels are on the increase. People tend to go out to restaurants and eat more than they used to do before. Sonia already mentioned these points before, but it's good with rehearsal, I think. So Sweden is one of the 27 member countries of the European Union. European Union is a custom union, meaning when goods has entered the union, it can travel freely between the countries without any additional tariffs of custom is added. Here's a quick checklist if you looking to start to export to the European Union. The first you have to do is classify the products according to the 10-digit system. Only then you will know the special requirements and the technical requirements of that particular product. And in order to gain reduced tariffs for custom by a free trade agreement, you will need to prove that your product was actually made in Guatemala. So you will need a certificate of origin, or a so-called Form A. General conditions are mainly documents. You will need to accompany your shipment with a commercial invoice, a packing list, bill of lading if the products are going by boat, or airway bill if it's going by air. And once you enter the first port of destination in Europe, you will need to have all this documentation in place in order to custom clear your goods. This is a bundle that's used by a Swedish supermarket chain, and by coincidence, it's the chain I used to work for, so I kind of stole this one. And basically, each box contains 2 words that's trying to describe the current trend. And after the coffee break today at 10, when we look into the different categories, I will have examples to explain this a bit more. But just to give you an idea, the one at the top says digital and analog. And that could relate to, if you compare with digital cameras, they've never been as high-tech as they are today, but still many are designed like they were made in the 1970s. So people tend to look back to where things were analog, because everything is moving so fast now with the digitalized world. This is basically the most important trend right now. All companies are discussing corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Some companies like to call it sustainability. Some call it only corporate responsibility. And basically it's about the importing company in Europe, the company selling the final product, that they should take responsibility for their actions within the supply chain. So they should take responsibility for the production site, where the product is made, that they are selling, that the workers are doing fine and not being exploited, and also for environmental questions. And this is relegated by so-called social certificates. Maybe fair trade is the most common one. They were the first one. But nowadays there are several, and each company tend to choose their own certification. And there's a model trying to explain what CSR is, and it's called the 3 Ps. It stands for people, that meaning workers in factories, for example. It stands for planet, meaning environment, and it stands for profit, which is the profit then for the European company. So one way at looking at it could be it's about justifying your profit. It's okay to have a profit as long as the people that produce the goods in a developing country is doing okay and have a minimum wage guaranteed and can join a trade union, etc. So, for example, if you look back in time, if there were a scandal or so in a fabric or production site in a developing country, the importing company in Europe could say, no, we didn't know, we had a contract, it's not our fault that people are mistreated in developing countries, but that is not okay anymore. Everybody expects the European big corporations to take responsibility about what's happening in developing countries and at the production sites where their products are made, that they sell. Consumers tend to go to the same supermarket to buy the groceries every week, And when they go to the same supermarket every week and spend the money to that same company, they also expect the company to do the right thing, to be transparent and honest and not buying goods from factories that are mistreating the workers. Furthermore, reputation of a company is extremely important. Nowadays, there's so many different channels of media, and media goes so fast. So companies can't afford bad media coverage. They need to think about the brand. And in the past, some companies niched themselves by being the best on CSR issues, but nowadays, that's basically in the past. Everybody needs to address these questions. And it's also a model from a supermarket chain. This one is from Holland, and how they work with corporate social responsibility, and from which countries they demand a so-called social certificate. And like Sonia said, these are voluntary, but in order to be able to supply directly to a retailer, this is something they demand. So basically, in red are all developing countries. And here are a few examples of media coverage. On top we have CNN, and they run a project called the Freedom Project. It's about ending modern day slavery, as they call it. They estimate that minimum 10 million people across the globe are considered to be forced labor. They are working against their will. But ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates that number to be over 20 million. Further down we have BBC, and they are reporting about child labor. They estimate 250 million children of school age working full-time in factories. So here's a simplified guideline for exporters or producers in developing countries that I need to follow. And basically, even though there are different social certificates, they follow this guideline. It's quite simple. It's minimum wage guaranteed, freedom to join trade unions, safe work environment, and no forced labor. If you look back 10 years in time, and there were a lot of certificates around, but there were much less than it is now. And back then, many times, companies sat down together and they decided upon one certificate they should apply for all. Nowadays, it's different. Every company needs to find their own niche. So there's a jungle of certificates out there, and it's really difficult for everyone to know what it stands for, and for producers, which they should choose. So here is maybe, 10% of what's around on the market for different products. Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, BSCI, and UTZ certified are all so-called social certificates. UTZ you find many times on coffee, same goes for Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. So even though European Union contains 20 member states and there is harmonized legislation, there are differences within the Union as well. If you look, this example is from fruit and vegetables. If you look at Northwest Europe, where Sweden is, global gap is mandatory. For pack houses, they mainly prefer a certificate called IFS. And for social certificates, they prefer BSCI. If you look to United Kingdom, they don't want to do the same things normally that Europe does. They want to do their own thing. So they have something called BRC for pack houses that they prefer. And they prefer ETI, which stands for Ethical Trading Initiative, for the social questions. And down in South Europe, these issues are actually not discussed that much yet. It will be, but until now, it's mainly about global gap. And all these discussions about corporate social responsibility also affects the supply chain. The one to the left is how it used to look, with a lot of different steps between production and product reaching the consumer. But For retailers, in order to be control of the production and create transparency, you need to cut a few steps and try to go direct as possible. That was it for now, and after the break we look more into the different categories that we're about to discuss today, coffee, etc. Thank you.